Welcome to The Explainer. We always hear about this big conflict, right? Archaeology versus the Bible. But what if that whole fight is based on, well, a simple mistake, a really, really old one? Today, we're going to dig into the science, the history, and a theory that honestly could completely flip how we see the ancient world. So, for years, the narrative has been pretty straightforward. Archaeologists dig up facts, hard evidence from the ground. And a lot of the time, that evidence just doesn't seem to line up with the stories in the Bible. But, and this is a big but, what if we've been asking the completely wrong question this whole time? What if the clash isn't really between science and scripture at all? What if it's actually between the evidence and the way we've been told to look at it? Okay, so let's get right into it. The heart of the mystery is this huge gap in the timeline. It's a gap that seems to put science and scripture on totally opposite teams. Here's the problem, plain and simple. You take the biblical timeline, you put it next to the standard archaeological timeline, and they just don't sync up. Now, the usual takeaway from that is, well, I guess the Bible got it wrong. But hold on, there's another way to look at this. What if the archaeological timeline itself is the problem? What if it's built on a foundation that's, let's just say, a little shaky and really, really old? And that leads us to our first big clue in this whole investigation. It's basically a case of mistaken identity, but one with massive, history-altering consequences. To really get what happened here, we need to talk about something called chronological anchor points. Just think of them like the big, important nails you use to hang a giant map on the wall. The entire timeline of the ancient world, it's all held in place by just a handful of these key known events. Now imagine what happens if one of those nails is in the wrong spot. The whole map just collapses. And this is where we find what might be a very weak nail. So the biblical king Shishak, he was identified as the Egyptian pharaoh Sheshonq I. And who made this connection? The famous Jean-Francois Champollion, the guy who cracked the Rosetta Stone. And his evidence, his big proof? The names kind of sounded alike. Seriously, that's it. A guess, based on how two names sound, became a cornerstone fact for dating everything. But here's the thing. When you actually look at the records side by side, they don't match. The Bible is super specific. It says King Shishak invaded the southern kingdom, Judah. But Pharaoh Shoshenq's own records carved in stone in Egypt, they tell a different story. They list cities he attacked, but they're mostly in the northern kingdom of Israel. I mean, that's a huge geographical mismatch. It really makes you question if they're talking about the same guy at all. Just let that sink in for a minute. One guess. A guess based on two names sounding similar. And it became a fundamental pillar of ancient history. For more than 100 years, every single artifact dug out of the ground, every ruin that's been studied, has been dated and understood based on this one single, unproven idea. Okay, so it's not just about this one shaky anchor point. We also have to look at the tools archaeologists use. I mean, what about the scientific methods themselves? Things like carbon-14 dating. Are they really as precise and objective as we all think they are? Let's take carbon-14 dating, for example. It's not a magic bullet. It doesn't spit out a single exact year. What it actually gives you is a range of possible dates, a window that can be hundreds of years wide. So what happens? Well, an archaeologist might look at that 300-year window and just pick the date that happens to fit the timeline they already believe in. It becomes this loop where the theory proves itself, And it's a similar story with stratigraphy. That's the science of dating things based on the layers of dirt they're found in. The idea is really simple, right? The deeper you go, the older the stuff is. Each layer is like a neat little slice of history. Yeah, but reality is messy. The ground is not a perfect layer cake. You've got earthquakes, floods, people building new stuff right on top of the old stuff. All of this just scrambles those layers completely. So what starts as a simple science ends up being way more subjective. It can really come down to one person's interpretation. So this all begs a pretty tough question, doesn't it? If these models have these known issues, why do people defend them so fiercely? The answer might not have anything to do with the evidence itself, but with the pressures inside the world of academia. And look, this isn't necessarily about some person having a bias. It's about the system itself. If you're an archaeologist rocking the boat and challenging a fundamental theory, that's a huge career risk. You could lose your funding, struggle to get published. It can damage your reputation in a field that, let's be honest, often rewards people for sticking with the status quo. So what if we do it? What if we actually adjust the timeline? What happens if we try to correct for these potential mistakes? what does the evidence actually show us then? Well, the picture that emerges is pretty fascinating. The whole argument boils down to this. If you fix that one potential error, that Shishak equals Sheshonq problem, the entire timeline slides. And when it does, suddenly, all this archaeological evidence that seemed to contradict the Bible, it starts to click into place. Things like the stories of the settlement in Canaan, the rise of the Israelite kingdom, they start to align. And all of this, it points to a much bigger question, doesn't it? It goes way beyond just one artifact or one ancient text. It makes us ask, what even is historical truth? Because in the end, maybe the real conflict was never between archaeology and the Bible. Maybe the conflict has always been between the actual physical evidence in the ground and the century-old model we've been forced to see it through. And that leaves us with one last, big, provocative question. How much of what we call settled history is actually settled, fact, and how much of it is just interpretation? It really challenges all of us to think more critically about the past and to always, always ask, how do we know what we think we know?